Nancy Reagan spent 52 years married to Ronald Reagan. And then 12 years alone, guarding his memory while her own body failed. This is the story almost no one knows. There is a particular kind of silence that follows power. Not the silence of scandal. Not the silence of defeat. But the silence that comes when devotion no longer has somewhere to land. In a quiet house in Bel Air, long after the motorcade stopped and the crowds dissolved into memory, Nancy Reagan would sit beside a man who had once commanded the attention of the world, and wait. Sometimes he looked at her with warmth. Sometimes he looked at her with polite confusion. And sometimes he looked through her entirely. History remembers the speeches, the negotiations, the Cold War thawing under bright lights and careful handshakes. What history rarely lingers on is the woman measuring time not in election cycles, but in seconds of recognition. Nancy Reagan was often described as elegant, as controlling, as influential. She was rarely described as afraid. And yet fear, quiet, disciplined, relentless fear, shaped nearly every major decision of her adult life. To understand her final years, you have to understand that fear did not begin in the White House. It began in childhood. She was born in Francis Robbins in 1921 in New York City. Her father drifted. Her mother, an actress chasing opportunity, moved frequently and left her daughter with relatives for long stretches. For the first 6 years of her life, Nancy was raised by an aunt and uncle in Maryland. She was cared for. But she was not chosen first. Children who grow up waiting internalize a specific lesson. Love is conditional. Presence is fragile. Security must be earned and guarded. When her mother remarried a respected Chicago neurosurgeon, Loyal Davis, Nancy entered stability at last. A new name. A prominent household. Structure. Expectations. But early instability does not disappear simply because circumstances improve. It settles quietly beneath. She became observant. Controlled. Attentive to tone shifts in conversation. She learned how to make herself essential. How to attach in a way that would make abandonment unlikely. At Smith College she studied drama, but long before that she had already mastered performance, not theatrical performance, but social performance. She understood presentation. She understood poise. She understood that image shapes power. Her acting career in Hollywood was respectable but not extraordinary. Supporting roles. A modest contract with MGM in 1949. A presence that was pleasant rather than commanding. What she truly excelled at was something less visible. She understood vulnerability in others. She could read need. She could position herself as the answer to that need. When she met Ronald Reagan in 1951, she did not simply see a charming man. She saw someone wounded by divorce, publicly confident but privately in need of reassurance. And she knew how to provide that reassurance with totality. They married in 1952. From that point forward, her identity began to consolidate around a single axis. Ronnie. Observers would later mock the way she looked at him during speeches, the famous unwavering gaze. It was labeled theatrical. Excessive. Artificial. It was not performance. It was vigilance. To Nancy Reagan, love meant watchfulness. Protection. Maintenance. When Ronald Reagan entered politics as governor of California in 1966, public scrutiny intensified. Staff members bristled at her involvement. Advisors felt observed. Journalists suggested she was meddling. But she did not see herself as interfering. She saw herself as stabilizing. The presidency in 1981 elevated both visibility and vulnerability. Within weeks, criticism mounted. She commissioned new china for the White House, 4,732 pieces costing around $209,000, paid for with private donations, not taxpayer money. But the optics were catastrophic. The country was in recession. Reagan's administration was cutting social programs. Accepted designer gowns on loan from top fashion houses. Hosted elaborate state dinners, 56 of them over 8 years, that dripped with Hollywood glamour. What critics interpreted as vanity, she interpreted as structure. Elegance was not indulgence in her mind. It was reinforcement. If the White House projected order, then the presidency felt secure. If appearances were controlled, then chaos was less likely to seep in. And then, 69 days into the administration, gunshots shattered the illusion. March 30, 1981. Ronald Reagan left the Washington Hilton Hotel after giving a speech. He walked toward his limousine. Secret Service agents surrounded him. The crowd pressed close. And then shots rang out. 6 rounds fired in less than 2 seconds. A Secret Service agent was hit. A D.C. police officer went down. Press Secretary James Brady was struck in the head. And one single bullet, ricocheted off the limousine and entered Ronald Reagan's chest, missing his heart by less than an inch. Nancy was at the White House when the call came. Initially, they told her he hadn't been hit. Just shaken. But something in her wouldn't accept it. She pushed. Asked again. And then they told her the truth. He'd been shot. He was being rushed to George Washington University Hospital. She arrived to find chaos. Medical teams. Secret Service. Confusion about how serious the injury was. Ronald, even then, tried to charm her. Tried to make a joke about forgetting to duck. He was attempting to reassure her. She was not smiling. He went into surgery. The bullet was lodged near his lung. The doctors worked for hours. Nancy sat. Waited. Tried to breathe through the terror. And when he survived, when they told her he would recover, something fundamental shifted inside her. Because she realized with absolute clarity that it could happen again. That every single time he walked into a crowd, stood on a stage, appeared in public, someone could be waiting. Someone with a gun. Someone with rage. Someone who could take him away from her. From that day forward, Nancy Reagan lived in a state of permanent, low-grade terror. She couldn't say this publicly. Couldn't admit the depth of the fear. But it was there, underneath everything. And in her desperation to find some way to manage the unmanageable, to gain even the smallest measure of control over the uncontrollable, she turned to someone she had known since their Hollywood days. A woman in San Francisco named Joan Quigley. An astrologer. Joan Quigley wasn't some back-alley fortune teller. She was a Vassar graduate. A published author. A well-connected socialite who had appeared on television, who moved in respectable circles. Nancy had first met her years earlier on Merv Griffin's talk show. Both Reagans had dabbled in astrology before, reading horoscopes, the kind of casual engagement many people have. But what began after the assassination attempt was something else entirely. Something systematic. Nancy started calling Quigley regularly. She would describe Ronald's upcoming schedule, travel plans, public appearances, press conferences, and Quigley would consult her charts. She would check planetary alignments, identify dates she considered favorable or unfavorable, and Nancy would use that information to push for changes. Departure times were shifted. Events were rescheduled. Speeches were moved to different days. For years, no one outside a very small circle knew. White House aides received constraints on the president's schedule without explanation. Some grew frustrated. But they complied. Fear without structure becomes unbearable. So she built structure. Astrology became less about superstition and more about managing randomness. After nearly losing him once, unpredictability felt intolerable. Consulting charts offered the illusion of control in a world that had proven violently unpredictable. Schedules shifted subtly. Appearances were reconsidered. Timing adjusted. Critics later framed it as eccentricity. But psychologically, it was survival. And then came Donald Reagan. No relation to the president. A Wall Street powerhouse who had run Merrill Lynch before becoming Treasury Secretary in Reagan's first term. In 1985, he swapped positions with Chief of Staff James Baker, and from that moment forward, he found himself in a quiet, bitter war with the First Lady. Nancy would call with instructions about scheduling. With concerns about specific staffers. With her assessments of policy decisions. Reagan believed he had been hired to serve the president. Nancy believed everyone in the White House existed to serve and protect Ronnie. The tension was inevitable. The breaking point came with Iran-Contra. In late 1986, it became public that members of the Reagan administration had secretly sold weapons to Iran, a country under arms embargo, and funneled the proceeds to Nicaraguan Contra rebels. It was one of the most serious scandals of Reagan's presidency. And as the story exploded, Nancy concluded that Donald Reagan had failed. That he had allowed the chaos to happen. That he was mismanaging the fallout. She pushed for him to resign. He resisted. The feud leaked to the press. Became ugly. Public. In February 1987, Reagan was forced out, or chose to leave, depending on whose account you believe. He did not go quietly. In 1988, Reagan published a memoir. In it, he described the astrology arrangement in extraordinary detail. He wrote that virtually every major move and decision during his tenure as chief of staff had been cleared in advance with a woman in San Francisco who drew up horoscopes to ensure the planets were in favorable alignment. Time magazine quickly identified her as Joan Quigley. The story detonated. The White House scrambled. Confirmed that Nancy had consulted an astrologer but insisted it had never influenced policy. Ronald Reagan said flatly that astrology had never affected his decisions. Nancy, in her 1989 memoir, acknowledged the practice but pushed back hard on how it was being characterized. She described it not as superstition but as a desperate attempt to keep her husband alive after watching someone try to kill him. She wrote that she had done everything she could think of to protect him. She wasn't wrong about the fear. The question was always whether the method was appropriate. And that question has never been definitively answered. What is clear is this. The revelation fundamentally changed how history would view Nancy Reagan's role. No longer just an elegant hostess. No longer just a devoted wife. But a woman who had been operating in the shadows of power itself, pulling levers, shaping decisions, protecting her husband through any means she could find. She was increasingly described as the power behind the throne. But power was never her objective. Continuity was. When the presidency ended in 1989 and they returned to California, many assumed her anxiety would ease. They purchased a home on St. Cloud Road in the affluent Bel Air neighborhood of Los Angeles with help from wealthy friends. They also had Rancho del Cielo, their beloved ranch in the hills above Santa Barbara, where Ronald loved to ride horses and clear brush. Those first years looked, from the outside, like a pleasant retirement. Instead, she began noticing small fractures. A repeated anecdote. A forgotten name. A pause that lingered too long. Alzheimer's disease does not announce itself dramatically. It whispers. It erodes. By the time Ronald Reagan publicly announced his diagnosis in 1994, Nancy had already begun mourning. In February 1994, Ronald Reagan gave what would turn out to be his final public speech, a gathering in Washington for his 83rd birthday. He delivered his remarks warmly, and the audience responded as they always did. But when they returned to their hotel suite afterward, he paused, looked around, and admitted quietly that he wasn't quite sure where he was. Nancy knew then. Shortly after, she took him to the Mayo Clinic. The doctors ran tests. Came back with their findings. Alzheimer's disease. On November 5, 1994, Ronald Reagan sat at his desk and wrote a letter to the American people in his own hand, in still strong script, telling them he had begun the journey that would lead him into the sunset of his life. It was an extraordinary act of public honesty. Very few public figures had ever spoken so openly about Alzheimer's. And for Nancy, it marked the beginning of something she would later call the long goodbye. The next decade stripped politics away and left only devotion. She became caregiver, manager, witness. Each morning she looked for signs of recognition. Some days he was almost himself. Other days he was distant, untethered from time. The early years were almost bearable. Ronald still went for walks. Still dressed carefully. Still smiled at everyone he passed. People who saw him during this time often remarked that he looked terrific. But beneath the surface, the man Nancy had known, the one who wrote her love letters and made her laugh and told her she was his entire world, was beginning to disappear. Some mornings he woke up almost himself. Other mornings, he wasn't sure where he was or what year it was. He would forget they had lived in the White House. Forget entire decades of his life. Nancy slept beside him as the disease progressed. Lay next to a man who would wake each morning a little less certain of who she was. She once told an interviewer, very quietly, that Alzheimer's was worse than the assassination attempt. Because at least with the shooting, there had been terror and then relief. This was different. This was a separation that happened while he was still physically present. A slow erasure of the person she loved, one day at a time. There were practical losses that followed, each one a small death. Ronald could no longer ride horses, the activity he loved most. His Secret Service agent had to tell him gently that it was no longer safe. Reagan reportedly had tears streaming down his face as he nodded, saying it was okay, that he understood. Nancy sold the ranch in 1998. There was no point keeping it. And she began what would become a decade of near-total devotion. She rarely left the Bel Air house. She managed the staff who helped care for him. protected his dignity with the same ferocity she had once used to protect his reputation. She read to him, sat beside him, maintained routine, protected dignity. When he could no longer ride horses, something inside him dimmed. When she sold the ranch, something inside her dimmed as well. In the process, something unexpected happened. Watching Ronald Reagan disappear into Alzheimer's did something to Nancy that surprised people who had only known her as a conservative Republican First Lady. It made her angry. Not at the disease. There was no target for that rage. But at the feeling that more could be done. That science had answers it wasn't being allowed to pursue. That politics was getting in the way of progress. The subject was embryonic stem cell research. In the early 2000s, there was genuine scientific excitement around the possibility that stem cells derived from human embryos could lead to treatments or even cures for diseases like Alzheimer's. The research was controversial because it involved embryos, and in August 2001, President George W. Bush signed an executive order severely limiting federal funding for it. The decision drew strong support from religious conservatives within the Republican Party. Nancy Reagan, Republican icon, devoted Catholic stepdaughter, former First Lady, did not care about any of that. What she cared about was Ronnie. And by extension, every other family watching someone they loved vanish. She began speaking publicly and forcefully in favor of expanded stem cell research. Met with scientists. Lobbied politicians. At a dinner in Washington, she reportedly pulled Bush's chief of staff, Andy Card, aside and pressed him directly to reconsider the administration's position. The administration did not change course. She kept pushing anyway. She co-founded the Ronald and Nancy Reagan Research Institute with the Alzheimer's Association. Used every platform available to her to make the case that the science deserved funding. And she did this as a woman in her 80s who was spending most of her time as a full-time caregiver to a man who no longer recognized her consistently. It was a remarkable transformation for someone who had been painted for years as interested only in fashion and image. And it earned her something she had never quite managed during the White House years. Genuine, widespread admiration across party lines. If there was even a fraction of hope that research could spare another family the erosion she was witnessing, she would pursue it. But back at the Bel Air house, the man she was fighting for continued to fade. By 2003, Ronald Reagan was rarely leaving home. Required constant supervision. Nancy managed his caregivers, oversaw his medical needs, spent hours each day simply being present, a presence he may not have always recognized but which she refused to withdraw. In his final months, she almost never left. She was 82 years old, and she was doing this nearly alone, with staff and a small circle of family, in a house on St. Cloud Road in Los Angeles. Ronald Reagan's personal physician, Dr. John Hutton, would later describe Nancy's devotion during this period as extraordinary even by the standards of caregiving, which is a world full of extraordinary devotion. She was there every morning, every evening. On the days when he seemed more present, she sat close. On the days when he seemed unreachable, she still sat close. In 2000, she published a collection of his letters to her. I love you, Ronnie. The letters of Ronald Reagan to Nancy Reagan. Reading them, it's not difficult to understand what she was mourning even while he was still alive. The man in those letters was funny, tender, extravagant in his affection. He wrote to her constantly throughout their marriage, on Valentine's Day, from hotel rooms, from campaign stops, from the Oval Office. In one letter, he told her he was not whole without her. That she was life itself. That when she was gone, he was merely waiting for her to return so he could start living again. That man was gone years before his heart finally stopped. And then, on the morning of June 5, 2004, after nearly a decade of Alzheimer's disease, Ronald Reagan died of pneumonia. He was 93 years old. And in the very last moment, according to their daughter Patty, he opened eyes that had been closed for days and looked directly at Nancy. Clear, Patty said. Full of something she had not seen in a very long time. Nancy would later say it was the greatest gift he could have given her. What happened next was one of the most elaborate public ceremonies the United States had seen in decades. And Nancy Reagan had planned every detail. She had been thinking about this for years, about what Ronnie deserved, about the tribute that was owed to him, about how history should receive him. She organized a 7-day state funeral with the precision and control she had always brought to everything. His body lay in repose at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library first, then was flown to Washington, where it lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda for 34 hours. Hundreds of thousands of people filed past. Heads of state came. Former presidents came. Margaret Thatcher, despite her own declining health, recorded a tribute rather than deliver it live. Nancy was at the center of every event. Stood in the rain at the Capitol. Sat through the national funeral service at Washington National Cathedral. She was composed. Controlled. Almost eerily stoic. Until the burial service. At the library in Simi Valley, at sunset, she finally allowed herself to break. She kissed the casket. Mouthed something quiet that no microphone caught. Received the folded flag. Then, for the first time in 52 years, she went home alone. The Bel Air house was the same. His clothes were still in the closet for some time. The routines that had been organized around his care, the caregivers, the medical equipment, the structured hours, were gone. In their place was silence. Friends and biographers who spoke with Nancy in the years that followed described her as truly alone in a way that was difficult to watch. She had built her entire adult life around one person. He had been the gravitational center of everything. And now there was no center. She told friends she missed him constantly. Continued to sleep in the same room. Kept photographs everywhere. Spoke about him as though he were still present. And in some sense, for her, he always was. But she did not disappear. And that was what surprised people. Grief for Nancy Reagan did not mean retreat. In the years after Ronald's death, she became what people close to her called the keeper of the flame, the most dedicated guardian of his memory and legacy. She threw herself into the work of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library with an intensity that impressed even those who had known her for decades. Attended anniversary events. Received guests. Met with scholars, politicians, foreign leaders who came to pay respects. In 2005, she was honored at a Washington gala with guests ranging from Dick Cheney to Condoleezza Rice to Harry Reid, a bipartisan gathering that reflected how her reputation had shifted in these later years. In 2007, she attended Gerald Ford's funeral. In 2011, she officiated at the ceremony marking what would have been Ronald Reagan's 100th birthday. She was in her mid to late 80s. She was still showing up. The stem cell advocacy continued as well. She was no longer fighting specifically for Ronnie. That battle was over. But she kept making the case. Kept lending her name and presence to the cause, understanding that whatever momentum she had built might help other families still in the middle of what she had endured. Those who spent time with her during this period often noted something that surprised them. She had been described for years as brittle, imperious, controlling. A woman who made enemies easily and held grudges longer. And some of that was certainly true. But in these final years, the edges seemed to soften. Or perhaps it was simply that the armor she had worn in public, the composed First Lady performance, had become unnecessary. There was nothing left to protect in the way she had once protected it. She talked more openly about loneliness. About what it meant to have structured your entire existence around another person and then find yourself without them. About how strange it was to attend events where people still treated her as if she were half of something when she was now entirely alone. Her health, meanwhile, was beginning to show the weight of everything she had carried. Nancy Reagan had always been small. During the White House years, she'd been described as slender to the point of delicate. By her 80s, she had become genuinely fragile. She had dealt with breast cancer in 1987, undergoing a mastectomy at a time when the subject was heavily stigmatized. She'd been frank about it, following Betty Ford's example, and her openness had been considered significant public service. But by her late 80s and into her 90s, more serious problems were emerging. She suffered falls at her Bel Air home that resulted in broken bones. Each fall, each fracture, was a marker of how much had changed. The falls were kept mostly private. Nancy did not want to be seen as diminished. She still had work to do. Her last major television interview was for a PBS documentary in 2010, conducted by Judy Woodruff. She talked about her husband, about the library, about their life together. She was sharp. Precise. Still Nancy Reagan. But public appearances became increasingly rare. The woman who had hosted 56 state dinners, who had organized a week-long state funeral, who had stood before cameras and crowds for decades, was spending more time in the house that held all the memories she had left. Friends visited. Her daughter Patty, whose relationship with her mother had been strained for years over disagreements that had played out publicly, had slowly moved toward reconciliation. They were never going to agree on everything. Never going to pretend the hard years hadn't happened. But there was a gradual drawing together that those around them found moving. Her son Ron remained close. Her stepson Michael, who had his own complicated history with the family, publicly expressed affection in the years after Ronald's death. It was not a perfect family. It had never been a perfect family. Nancy had never pretended otherwise. But in these last years, it was a family that was showing up. The Bel Air house became her world in these final months. A small world. But hers. On the morning of March 6, 2016, Nancy Reagan died at her home in Bel Air. The cause was congestive heart failure. She was 94 years old. The announcement came from the Reagan Foundation through her spokeswoman, Joanne Drake. Within hours, tributes began pouring in from around the world. From presidents and former presidents. From foreign leaders. From people who had loved her and people who had spent decades criticizing her. President Barack Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama released a statement expressing sorrow. Former President George W. Bush called her fiercely loyal to the country. Barbara Bush said Nancy had been totally devoted to her beloved husband and took comfort in believing they would be reunited. Arnold Schwarzenegger wrote that she had served with unbelievable power, class, and grace. Her stepson Michael wrote something simpler. That she was once again with the man she loved. On March 11, 2016, 5 days after her death, Nancy Reagan was buried at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. The funeral drew former first families, presidents and first ladies, presidential children. She was laid to rest beside Ronald Reagan on the hillside at the library, looking out over the Santa Susana Mountains and valley below. He had once told his biographer that when the time came, they would seal the door temporarily until she joined him, and then they would lie there together and look at the sea. She was 94. He had died at 93. Between them, they had lived nearly 2 full centuries. And now it was done. The question of how to understand Nancy Reagan, what she was, what she did, what it cost, and what she gave, does not resolve itself easily. She came to Washington as a Hollywood actress with a reputation for glamour and a singular, consuming devotion to her husband. She left after 8 years as one of the most influential and least understood first ladies in American history. Not because she held formal power. She never claimed that. But because she understood that proximity to power, wielded carefully, was a form of power in itself. She had pushed to have a chief of staff fired. Lobbied foreign policy advisors. Quietly shaped the president's schedule for years through channels most people didn't know existed. She had nudged her husband toward engaging with the Soviet Union at a moment when hawks in the administration opposed it. And whatever one thinks of astrology or motives, those negotiations eventually led to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987 and helped thaw a Cold War that had defined her entire adult life. She had also been vain, protective, sometimes ruthless. She feuded publicly. Held grudges. Was willing to use the press as a weapon when it suited her. She was not a saint. She would have been the first to tell you so. Her relationship with her children was proof enough. Patty Davis spent years not just estranged but actively writing about the distance between them, in novels, memoirs, public interviews. Michael Reagan had his own complicated history. Ron broke from the conservative politics his parents embodied. Even at the height of White House power, Nancy Reagan had not managed to hold the family together in the ways a First Lady's image suggests. That gap between public portrait and private reality was one she carried always. But she had also sat beside a man who no longer knew her name and held his hand every day for years. Built a public health initiative around the disease taking him. Spoken openly about breast cancer when women were expected to suffer privately. Spent her 80s alone, widowed, physically diminishing, still showing up to protect a legacy that was no longer in danger of being forgotten. Power for Nancy Reagan was never purely political. It was personal. It was the power to protect the thing she loved most. And that thing, Ronnie, always Ronnie, had been gone for 12 years by the time she died. She spent those 12 years making sure the world did not forget him. That is the price she paid. And it is also the thing she chose. She once said plainly that her life began when she married Ronald Reagan. Many found that kind of statement difficult to understand, a brilliant, capable woman defining herself entirely in relation to another person. But she was not being self-deprecating. She was being precise. That was, in her own accounting, the truth of her life. And she never apologized for it. Not once. Not even at the very end. Nancy Reagan once said her life began when she married Ronald Reagan. Some heard self-erasure. Perhaps it was simply precision. She did not crave spotlight. She craved center. And when the center faded, she remained beside it anyway. In the end, her story is not primarily about political influence. It is about attachment. About a child who once learned that presence is fragile, and who spent the rest of her life trying to make it permanent. She guarded his schedule. She guarded his image. She guarded his body. And when memory itself could no longer be guarded, she guarded his dignity. There is a photograph from 2004. An elderly woman standing beside a flag-draped casket, small against the weight of marble and history. If you look closely, you will not see fragility. You will see completion. She had fulfilled the only promise she ever believed was hers to keep. Not a political promise. A personal one. And it cost her everything. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.